mugshots of people represent an incredible cross-section of society.
They were people in a situation that none of us really wants to be in, but there they are.
In these pictures, there was a whole story, like an American history that wasn't being told.
I began to see myself as a person who was trying to stop people disappearing, people who otherwise definitely would disappear.
In a mugshot, whether the person is guilty or innocent, when that shutter clicks, they're in trouble.
Mugshots have become entertainment. Once they're out there, especially these days, they don't go away.
When you get out of prison, you never really pay your debt to society because it follows you for the rest of your life. It follows you for the rest of your life.
In America, it's just a way of life for the publication of mugshots. We see them on the news all the time. Our laws here in North Carolina require that they be made public. Once the photographs are taken at the time of arrest, they go into our database. From there, each night, the IT section of Wake County grab those photographs and move them over into a file that's accessible by the media. Publications such as the Slammer magazine, they can go in around 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock, I believe it is, and access the prior 24-hour mugshots.
Citizens have the right to know whom is being arrested in their community. And the Slammer has a goal to publish every arrest in each market every week. The mission statement of the Slammer is to inform the community on matters of crime and public safety, to aid law enforcement in solving and deterring crimes, and to satisfy the natural curiosity of our readers. People like to be entertained, and as callous as it may be, viewing other people's crazy mugshots can definitely be entertaining.
It serves really only to satisfy the natural curiosity and to titillate the public about who in their neighborhood or in their family may have done this or that. And you just say, well, at least that's not me.
Well, when I went to jail, I shot a fella. The most embarrassing thing is to see my picture in the newspaper. Embarrassed for my family and friends to see what I've done. That's who I used to be. I don't want to be that guy anymore.
It's a little bit degrading. It is, because you know exactly where that picture's going to go. And the next day it comes out in the Slammer, so thank goodness I wasn't on the front page. I got arrested for DWI and possession of alcohol at the time. I was a minor, obviously 17 years old, so not allowed to drink, and sure enough, not allowed to drive. I kind of like it, though, because I get to keep tabs on my friends and people that I know. You know, I'll open it up once a week. Oh, there's somebody. Saw a customer in here last week. So we get to see familiar faces all the time, and it's a good laugh now.
I get the appeal of, you know, Slammer kind of like publications in a particular town. If they published one in New York, it would be like 90 pages, you know, I mean, for, you know, hundreds of pages. We don't really do that. Some guy gets arrested for drunk driving, staring into the camera. I don't really care about images like that. But if that person has like a Justin Bieber hairdo or has something that's kind of like visually arresting, you know, that's where I'm interested in it. We publish them just on the basis of, well, we think that's an interesting or funny or amusing photo. And for the most part, we don't attach people's names to them, because if someone went and typed your name into Google, our thing is going to be the first thing that comes up if we attach your name to it. The name doesn't really add anything to it.
People, first and foremost, have a right to know this information. I have the right to know if a rapist, accused rapist even, is living next door to my family.
Unless it helps you find the criminal or to solve a crime, there's no reason to make all those things public. But in Canada, it's very different than the United States. In the United States, it's public information, and that picture and everything else, mugshot, go on these newspapers and websites. Here it doesn't. It just goes to the police forces. And we're really careful with that. You don't want vigilantes, which has happened in the United States, going after people.
Certainly as a Canadian, I am very grateful to be on the more conservative side. Of course, we have pretty careful laws to protect privacy and also to provide freedom of information, where mugshots like these are not released to the public until after 100 years have passed. And, you know, it's not the same situation in the United States at all.
We have taken a position as a society that it is part of our constitutional right that our courts are open. And then once you make a decision that that information is part of the public domain, then the public can use that information as it sees fit. And if it's also a profit-making venture, so be it.
This is actually a magazine that exploits mugshots for money, because my picture is in there and he's making money off of it. Sometimes I feel like I should be rewarded because you're getting paid off of my picture. And I have experienced it, and I have been in prison, and I know what that is like. These people in these magazines that we see, they're real people, and they have real lives, and that should be respected.
The idea of mugshots being made available to the public goes back for decades. The FBI used it quite a bit. Their 10 most wanted, they put them up in the post office.
1839 is when the daguerreotype was first invented, and it's 2 years later that it's identified by the police as being something of interest. But these things happen in small ways. It's really in Europe where it really becomes established, and the Bertillon system, named after Alphonse Bertillon, was a way to try and identify criminals with the idea that if you've got somebody who is reoffending, you're going to be able to identify them and more easily stop them from committing that crime. He came up with basically two systems. It was photographing that individual and also measuring that person in a very detailed, standardized way. And it's only right around when it's beginning to be standardized and adopted across the board by police in North America that fingerprinting emerges, and it sort of blows the Bertillon system all to the one side, with the exception of photography, because the mugshot is maintained along with fingerprints. For me as the exhibition curator of Arresting Images, which is a traveling exhibition based on a collection of mugshots from the late 19th century that were collected by police. What was so great was knowing that you're right near the beginning. This is where it's all beginning to come together and beginning to happen, and it's exciting to see that and see something taking shape. So when I started to work with the collection, it became clearer that it really was quite unusual, because there doesn't appear to be another collection like it in Canada, or in fact North America, of this age.
A lot of the mugshots that are around tend to be mid-20th century or early 20th century mugshots, where theirs went back into the 19th century. So what you also get is different conventions of portraiture, glass plates. Sometimes they would use like softer focus lenses and what have you, so they don't, to me, seem to be as clinical as modern day snapshots. So it allows you a certain air of nostalgia around these, and it almost makes crime look like it was a much more genteel pastime in the 19th century than it does in the 20th.
In there are 474 portraits of people who have all been arrested, and all we knew about them was what was written on the back of the image. And in some cases, the photograph may not be of particularly high quality, slightly out of focus, but the story that we found out about through tough and hard research may mean that this is a special, special story. As he began to work with these images, and there's this set of eyes looking out at you, they're looking out at you at a moment that is not probably the greatest moment in their life. They're looking at you at the moment of arrest, and you're being photographed for that reason. And that's a pretty significant moment to have frozen in time and to be looking at over 100 years later. Those people's stories, they draw us, and we wonder what crime were they charged with, and what does a criminal look like? Criminal often looks like us.
Very rarely can you tell the person behind the picture or the mugshot, that is to say, the criminal mind. The criminal mind doesn't photograph.
I think we're very primitive in a way, and we want to see an indication of badness. We want to see something that separates bad people from us. Is it in the eyes? Is it in the nose? Is it in the configuration of the mouth? You know, where is it? I'm a photographer and also a collector, as evidenced by what is around me. And one of my collections is a collection of glass negatives of mugshots that were taken in about 1904 to 1908. I found these glass negatives in an antique store in California, and I held them up to the light, and having no idea what they were, saw these incredible portraits in negative, and written on each image was the name of the person and a crime underneath it. And I was so entranced by this that I set about in a very dogged way to find out who had taken the pictures, when were they taken, and over a 2-year period, I was able to collect 1,500 more. Further research led me to know that the photographer is a woman, Mrs. Clara Smith, and she had the contract to photograph newly arrested men in the small town of Marysville in California. When I first looked at these negatives, I found something in them that was unique. They were not your standard set the guy up, set the lights up, take the picture, next. And I couldn't imagine why. Clara Smith was the town photographer. When I saw some of her other photographs of babies and graduates and brides, she had left the lighting the same, regardless of subject. So she had a bride all in white, happiest day of her life, and then would move in a prisoner, the worst day of his life, and yet the lighting was the same. And somehow it was extraordinarily more effective with the prisoner, because a lot of these men, I would guess, had never been photographed. And they certainly had not been photographed by a matronly woman in her 60s. And I think that she totally disarmed them. And that's what I tried to take from her. I photographed dead bodies. I photographed these facial reconstructions of murder victims. And I always try to bring that same respect. And I used her as a muse of sorts.
I think a lot of photographers have been inspired by mugshots. For me, a mugshot is also a subset of portraiture. I want to find a mugshot that's as great as a Rembrandt portrait or a Van Gogh portrait, that has that kind of resonance, that kind of psychological intensity, emotional intensity. But it's always achieved within this context of incarceration and photography under duress. So there's a range of emotions being expressed, but they're all within that certain context of the deprivation of freedom. We know that they're stuck, and they know that they're stuck. They become specimens, they become animals in a zoo, and it makes a very tense psychological interchange between the image and ourselves. We can see the personality rendered with clarity and beauty and force and sensuality through a mugshot. So why not call it a work of art?
Well, it's become artwork. I don't think a mugshot intrinsically ever was artwork. But then, you know, with people like Andy Warhol who have taken a lot of things and I mean, a Campbell's soup can isn't artwork either, but if you're a great artist, you can make art of it, and that's what people have done, which is fine. But I'm sorry, I just don't agree with the mugshot as art. Essentially, it is just a photograph, not a very good photograph.
Not every mugshot is marvelous. There are plenty of boring ones, there's plenty of ordinary people, but there are some that are just amazing. The faces, the portraits, the fashion, there's so many elements to these images. I'm a descendant of Andy Warhol. Nothing was the same after Andy, and I found a lot of the things that I liked about Andy's work in these mugshots.
Mark Michael said he sees them the way Andy saw them. He sees each one as a work of art in its own way, and he knows what to get. That's the best way to use it. The way Marx used the mugshots is creating great works of art out of it.
I feel very connected to the people in my collection, the people in these photos. I have a lot of sympathy for them, and I try to treat them with dignity in the street art I do and collages that I make with their faces. I feel like I have a responsibility to treat them with respect. I like the energy of the street art, the non-commercial aspect of it, and I've just played around with pasting up some of these blow-up pictures, and it's amazing how they stand out in the cityscape, and it's really, to me, an unbelievably striking image, which carries a lot of power and a lot of content. What's embodied in the picture is the human existence, the sad and tragical and other side of life, the underside of life. It's dramatic, it's got emotional intensity, and also it can be whimsical and amusing.
The opportunity to make art out of misery is certainly there, and if you were chronicling humanity and you wanted a source of a lot of samples of what humanity looks like, I mean, that certainly supplies it. Everybody from the very rich and famous to the very poor and lowly are represented in them. And some people are in the best of situations in silk suits when they're getting their forced pictures taken, and some of them are bums off the street.
People look pretty grim in mugshots because you're in a hostile environment, you've been arrested, you spent the night in jail, suddenly all these lights are on you, and you did something horrible maybe the night before, or you don't even remember.
Most of the time when people get arrested, they're not at their best. And I don't believe that anybody gives classes in how to take a good mugshot. But I would suggest if you're getting arrested that you try to make sure that you're reasonably together. You don't want to be too disheveled and you don't want to be crazy. And it helps to have shaved within the last week and have your hair done. And you don't want to look guilty. You don't want to smile real big either, because then the question is, why are you being happy about being arrested?
You know, a lot of people say that criminals never think that they'll ever be caught, and so obviously they're caught because they're being photographed. But you've got a subject who is under duress, and then you have a photographer who's really not interested in anything but getting the job done as quickly as possible. In the case of mugshots, you're really left with what it is that that criminal wanted to project, because they have very little left to them, and yet I think they're still in some ways trying to exert their bravado, maybe exert their innocence, but they're really trying to push their facial expressions as much as they can to work to their own advantage. So you've got the sitter that actually has a bit more power than they do in a traditional portrait, and yet that power is being circumvented because they've actually lost their rights.
A picture's worth 1,000 words. That's what each mugshot really tells. Whether it's the guy that partied too late on Saturday night and you see his 3 a.m. mugshot, or maybe an older person that's been writing bad checks. You know, maybe the story that the slammer tells for historians is what this country was like when drug problems and poverty were as prevalent as they are. Because I'd say the bulk of the mugshots taken are of the poor and disenfranchised in our communities.
Those are really, really small time drunken drivers or people who didn't pay child support. And there's a way in which they're being held up to public ridicule, used as cheap entertainment. But of course, that fits in with the whole reality culture of today. And people, of course, voluntarily give themselves up as subjects for cheap entertainment.
We've had people call the newspaper and beg to be in the newspaper, to beg to be on the cover of the newspaper, called despondent when they weren't in that issue and want to be on following issues. But I think it goes back to ultimately people's fascination with crime. And this newspaper is a lighthearted embodiment of local crime.
There's a lot of people that seem to take pleasure in the plight of others because it actually lifts them up. I think especially when you get to the area of celebrity mugshots, people just love it when these famous people are taken down a peg or two. And I think a lot of it's jealousy. I think a lot of it's very petty. But I think it's still that failure that people have to just be content with themselves. I think they always have to compare themselves to someone else. And there's no greater gap that someone feels than them being able to enjoy freedom looking at someone that's got like a number in front of their chest, because we think so little of criminals.
I'd been drawing people's faces for a long time. I was looking for subjects, photographs to draw faces, and I came across a book by Mark Michelson called Least Wanted, which seemed to be a great resource for somebody who wanted to draw faces and use them in their art, because it's packed full of the most amazing, characterful faces. So these drawings I was doing turned out great. I was really pleased with what was happening, and they were selling, and I thought, I'm making a bit of money here. But still, I thought I'd quite like to be using images that are my own rather than from this book. So I went on eBay and started searching for mugshots. And the first set I got were these 5 mugshots from Newcastle, Pennsylvania. And the pictures come with an information card. And I'm very research-minded. I hopped on the newspaper archive site and entered these names. The first mugshot I checked out, the guy was called Martin Phobes. He had been arrested for being an intoxicated driver. And up pops this story about local man held for suspected murder. And it was the date that he'd been arrested on from this mugshot. And I got to say, it felt like just falling through a hole. After a long night drinking in downtown bars, Martin Phobes offered a young woman named Anna Grace Robertson a ride home in his truck. Half an hour later, her battered, unconscious body was found in the middle of the street, where she had jumped from Martin's truck when she realized he was driving her out of town. She died 3 days later. Martin was found guilty of leaving the scene of an accident. But I believe that he was guilty of something very close to murder. The sad death aside, I was thrilled to find all this stuff from this one mugshot. And I thought, wow, if this mugshot has all this behind it, what have I got here? So I set up a website, called it Small Town Noir, and I gathered more and more of these stories. But gradually looking through the history of the people in them, things about the town kept coming up, kept recurring in these stories, and places and streets and churches and things would pop up again and again in these stories. And you begin to get a shape of the town. So once I decided that the town was what was important, I knew I had to come to Newcastle at some point, even though it's not a part of America that people from Europe tend to travel to go and see. To me, it was a place I had to come to.
Dearman's a heck of a nice guy, but personally, I thought he was nuts. I thought, why in the world would anybody in their right mind want to come to Newcastle when they're from Scotland, a country with such a great history and historic places? So yeah, I did think he was sort of insane when I first met him.
When I first came to Newcastle, obviously my head was full of images of the town as I read about it from the 40s and the 50s, when it was this bustling, busy centre of industry. The difference between my idea of what it was going to be like and the reality of seeing this town now was vast. The evidence of shut-down industry, which had not been replaced with anything else, was everywhere and just saddening. It felt almost uncanny walking around there, and I knew that there'd been a great falling off in the steel industry in this part of the world, and towns like this had effectively died. It's one thing to hear that and know it, and it's another thing to walk through the streets of a place where that's happened. It looked like there'd been a war, and that this town had lost the war.
When I first started, it was the beginning of the economic recession for the steel industry. So slowly the town did deteriorate as far as the businesses that had once been there. Town was kind of wild. It was a pretty good ride keeping it under control at times. During the time most of the Dearman's collection came from, crime was a lot different. The Depression was in full swing. We had a huge railroad yard here. There was a lot of theft from boxcars, a lot of drunks and disorderlies, which aren't necessarily bad people. I think everybody gets in their cups once in a while. And some of them are comical because you see people with busted heads and bandages and whatnot on them. But that tells you right there it was a different type of law enforcement.
Some of these men were bad men. And I think we forget that through this filter, this kind of yield filter. John Holland, his crime was murder, and he murdered Josie St. Clair, who was a prostitute. His attorney was so convinced of his innocence that he was writing letters for years to parole boards, that he had been framed by what the attorney said were the 3 Ps: pimps, prostitutes, and police, all of whom he put in the same category. Frank Clark's crime was a particularly nasty one. He was accused and convicted of raping his 12-year-old stepdaughter, whom he would move from hotel to hotel so as not to be caught. A very vulnerable girl, her mother had just died, and he had, according to court records, promised to take care of her. And years later, I believe when he was released, he committed rape again. This is Claude Hankins. He was arrested for the murder of a ranch hand that he had worked with. He went up and shot the man in the back of the head, cold-blooded, and stole $7 from him. And then went to town and had a nice dinner and then checked into a motel. And he was caught later that evening.
what made this little boy kill? It's like, if he looks like that, if he looks like an innocent little boy, when I look in the mirror, am I shielding the same secrets or similar secrets? What is this face telling me? What is it telling me about my face? It opens a door. It opens a door into oneself. It opens a door to history. I see myself in them.
A lot of what we do when we're looking at photographs is just project ourselves onto them. And on occasion, you'll hear people describing photographs or talking about the meanings of photographs, and they don't realize how intensely personal they're revealing themselves. A lot of photographs touch people in a very direct way, and people will just go with it because, again, they're projecting themselves into these pictures.
I'm certainly not the first guy to be fascinated with mugshots. Andy Warhol, for the World's Fair, famously put up the 13 most wanted men, which didn't go over very well.
Some places make you happy just to be in them.
For the New York State Pavilion for the World's Fair, Andy Warhol was asked by Robert Moses to contribute artwork.
We have roamed these United States and literally combed the globe for pavilions and exhibits which will reflect the achievements of all men in industry, culture, the arts, and harmless entertainment.
There were about 10 artists who were asked to make artworks that would be on the sides of this circular building. And Warhol really wasn't quite sure what to do.
Andy he said it all, oh, I don't have an idea, you know, like that. Everyone had great ideas. So Win Chamberlain said, well, Andy, the 10 most wanted men, mugshots of the 10 most wanted men. And I was here and Andy was there. It was one of those great ideas. I said, oh, you know, a great idea, you go like that. I looked at Andy and Andy went like that. And I said, what a great idea. And Andy said, oh, well, yes.
There was the notion that now, after the upside of the American coin, he was going to the flip side. Warhol was really turning to say, well, what's the underbelly of all of this? What he did was took the images of these 13 men that was from a brochure from 1953 to basically say, if you see this guy, let us know. He's wanted for such and such a crime. Most wanted. But what does most wanted mean? Obviously, it meant they were the most vicious, egregious crimes of that year. But also most wanted may have been about anyone looking at them, seeing them as desirable. Many of them have these very Italian, swarthy guys with this hair all moosed up. Think of Frankie Avalon or Fabian of those years. And they were quite sexy. So was this really about homosexuality? And this bunch of guys being in a gay bar or a party, looking at one another, checking one another out, deciding whom they want to go home with for the evening. So he did the works and put them up, and all of a sudden, Robert Moses thought it was not a good idea to represent the state of New York by criminality.
The mugshots, the most wanted that Andy used on the New York State Pavilion, were all real mugshots for the time. I mean, these were people who had murdered, robbed banks. Andy didn't think of it for a second that they were alive and a danger to the public. It was just the image that he was really fascinated by. That was the power of the image. Robert Moses freaks out that this can't be, this is impossible, and they're taken down almost instantly. It was sort of like, well, they were put up, and then the next was a scandal, and I think they were almost taken down the next day. Then Andy still has to do something on this pavilion.
So then Andy said, okay, well then what I want done is I'll give you a color, a specific color of silver, and we'll paint all of them silver, and then that will remain up for the run of the fair, which was, I think, a year and a half. So they were only up for about a week, and then the rest of the fair, they were left silvered.
It's curious that those paintings that are now destroyed were among probably his best. The mugshots were sort of the earliest superstars. But then what is a superstar? The superstar is some kind of a person who generates fabulous emotion. And so these men and women who are the mugshots are these people who have just been arrested and are going through very strong passions, very strong emotions, because they're being put in the clanker, they're being put in jail. So maybe that's the power behind a mugshot. This is the moment of stardom.
Well, this is Henry Earle
perhaps the most famous mugshot celebrity in the world, at least in terms of his prodigious number of arrests. We did a story a couple of years ago about Henry Earle when it was reported that he was arrested for the 1000th time. But we've gotten to see Henry Earle grow up in this series of mugshots that we so lovingly collect. And I worry, you know, when I go in and I see that he's not been in jail for 2 weeks, I think, oh man, I hope something didn't happen to Henry Earle. But then he's in for 2 days later and I'm very happy again.
Nothing is more interesting than human beings. And I think people are fascinated by these photographs for a million different reasons. I'm a graphic designer. I'm an art director. I'm not a historian. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not an anthropologist. I'm just drawn to these things. My interest as a graphic designer with typography, materials, the paper, the manila folders, the cards, the things that made them not just a flat image, they were really an object, like a collage, like a work of art. And they're sexy too. They're involved with crime and the underworld, and people have always been interested in the dark side of life. Everybody has seen the mugshots of celebrities, the movie stars, and the famous gangsters throughout history, but I wasn't really interested in that. I was interested in the small-time people, the people who fall through the cracks, the minor characters in history. These are the least wanted. Pretty soon, I had several notebooks full, then I had boxes full, and now I have, could be 15,000. Too many to count. And as the collection grew, more and more odd and interesting things came out. There were old people, there were children, there was every kind of prostitute and communist and just unbelievable things. And I started to realize that in these pictures, there was a whole story, like an American history that wasn't being told.
What I find most valuable about mugshots is that they give us the photographs and identifying details of a lot of people who may not otherwise ever have been photographed. This is the first instance of ordinary citizens that we have a detailed record of what they look like and what their names were and what they practiced. There's something about it that is just rooted to the history of the United States. They're precious, these documents.
The common people are always much more interesting. I mean, it's always much more interesting to read about the little guy than the great historical figure that beat his chest. It's a great history. I mean, it's a history of police, it's a history of people, it's a history of society. What more could you want? If you're a historian, it's a gold mine. It's an absolute gold mine.
Aaron Cézanne, 4th April 1939, fornication. Sofia Laishuka, 2nd February 1946, abduction. Vincent DeLillo, 17th November 1937, rolling drunks. Lee Render, 24th September 1945, window peeping. There are a lot of mugshot collectors, and I think the reason is, there's at least one good story here. That's one big reason why mugshots have become this fascination that we see in the world. Charles Isolde was a well-turned-out young man with the intellect of a child. He had no idea why he raised the false fire alarm. He told the police, "I don't know why I did it." 2 years later, Charles was left all alone when his mother was murdered by his stepfather, who had gone insane. His mother's colleagues at the hospital gave him a job as a custodian there. He remained in the job until he retired in the 1980s. Katie Payne took a razor blade to the house where her husband had set up home with another woman and slashed her legs, arms, and hands. She spent a week in jail. Katie and her husband remained married for the rest of their lives and died within months of each other in 1963. One of the remarkable things that started happening after I put the website up was that people would start to get in touch with me from Newcastle, relatives of people in these mugshots. Hey, that's my uncle, that's my father, that's my granddad. I'd always been aware that I was dealing with real people, but that kind of brought it home to me that they really exist. These stories are of real lives.
I never seen a picture of my dad that young, maybe like 23 or 24. The only pictures I ever saw were, of course, when he was alive in maybe 60s, 70s, and all the way up into the 80s, but nothing that young. So I was really fascinated about that, my dad being, that young, and actually had hair, too. Not much, but some. I looked at the picture on the internet and just started studying it, and then it just brought my dad out to a T. His nature always was it's either his way or the highway, and there was no in between. I mean, you could see the marks on his face, around his eyes, that you could really tell somebody, laid a number on him. One of the officers took out his police .38, put it up to his ear, and fired a shot right across his ear to scare him. But you could tell by the picture that no matter what was going to happen, you're not going to intimidate me one little bit.
I'm the only person with these mugshots, full of people from Newcastle, Pennsylvania. I am able to make sure that someone knows who these people are. I kind of feel almost an obligation to record these people's lives and make sure that they're not forgotten. I feel like an ordinary person. I'm not a famous person. I hope that there is an importance about ordinary people and making sure that these people don't go. And if I can help to save them, not to be grandiose about it, but in a certain way, I feel like I'm saving myself at the same time.
To be honest, I'm not that enamored with mugshots. It's one thing to publish a newspaper that finds its way eventually to recycling and it's on to the next issue. But with all of these records making their way to the internet, I'm afraid there's going to be profound and long-lasting consequences for those unfortunate people that find their way into jail.
Every mugshot is stamped bad. You did something wrong. How do we not be you? Once they're out there, especially these days, they don't go away. Are we damning these people based on this document when we know nothing? People are very faceted, and if you start darkening some of those facets, what happens to the life of that person?
I would liken it to a very good soap opera. Some people just like to see who went to jail. Like to see what they went to jail for. However, I would like for them to understand me. And the only part they understand about me is that I got arrested and I'm in jail. Because they have my picture and they have this charge. They don't really know me, They don't know that, when I was in high school, I was in college prep and could have went to college. They don't know that I was actually recruited for the Marines. They don't know that when I was in the penitentiary that I actually went to school and got, a bit of a higher education, even while I was in the penitentiary. They don't know that, I was raised up in the Word of God, and they don't know that, God lives in me. They don't know this. All they know is that Ed Newsom was locked up for possession of marijuana. They don't really know that Ed is a good guy just because he's, he might allegedly smoke a little trees. They don't know the other stuff, and they get locked in on the charge, and that just totally destroys. It's kind of like character assassination to a certain degree.
When I first saw the paper, I'm thinking, okay, these are habitual criminals. They murderers. And then when I look at the fine print up under their faces for an open container, and it makes them look bad, and it makes a person feel like, okay, I get this charge or whatever. What is that going to do for me if I'm going to look for a job?
Someone, saw your picture in there and saw your charges, obviously that's going to come up and be an issue. If I see someone in the slammer, I'm not hiring you. Just because I know you have a record. I know that's a little bit discriminating because obviously I have a record. But, I'm a good character and I want my business to run properly, so you got to have the right people for the job.
I think it's very likely that over the next 15 to 20 years, the United States will move more towards a Canadian or European stance on how these records are regarded. Right now, the idea that someone's arrested, they're charged with a crime, and that moment in time is recorded and disseminated is, I think, very agreeable to every civil libertarian and community-minded citizen. The idea that a 15-year-old that gets picked up for an open container will have this mugshot as a top entry on Google until the day they go visit their grandchildren in the hospital. This country's not going to stand for that.
I do understand some of the ethical objections to circulating mugshots. But, let's just separate that out for a minute. It's not really the mugshot, the image, that is the problem. It's the information encapsulated with the image. It's the name of the person listed with the crime, and that information could be used against someone. On the other hand, if we tried to eliminate the name of every criminal from every history book or record, we would have no records, we would have no history. Let's face it. Yes, they probably should have been destroyed. They were meant to be kept in institutional archive setting. But what value do they have to us? You really have a sort of history of America through mugshots. You see images of everyday people. You see that image, how it evolves over time. Everything changes, and you can see that evolve in this little box of the mugshot. And it's also a way of becoming intimate, of having a real contact with your own history, with America, with a bunch of people who, I find quite interesting and quite beautiful in their humanity.
Very few things that exist carry that kind of weight, that power that these pictures have. My collection runs up until about the 1960s, and I've found that mugshots that are more recent than that, they're not as marvelous as the older ones. I'm not really that interested in any mugshots that are being taken today. They're digital photographs, there's no hard copy original, and they don't have that filter that time gives them.
In 100 years' time, the slammer will be fantastic. It's going to be a great document of people's faces in the early 21st century. That's if there was an equivalent of the slammer from 1912, I'd spend big money getting it, because that would be a fantastic thing to have. It's just a question of time with the slammer. What's inappropriate just now will be really valuable social history later on.
I will not feel sad about parting with the slammer when the time comes. As much fun as it's been, as rewarding as it's been, the jobs we created, and almost an industry we created, has been very validating. At the same time, there are other things to life than crime and mugshots.